Hey folks, we're talking about consent again today, so here's another trigger warning for sexual assault, discussion of various types of abusive dynamics, and also brief mention, though not discussion, of self-harm and suicide. Consent part 1 was largely about why the requirement for people to explicitly say no to unwanted sexual activity was insufficient and unhelpful, and how we may implement the more efficient alternative of yes means yes. There is a link right over there, so if you haven't seen that one, I recommend you watch that one first. Don't worry, we'll wait for you. Are you back? Good. In this part, we'll explore under which conditions even yes might not constitute consent. As mentioned in the previous video, consent must be freely given, and there are a number of factors which can infringe on people's ability to do so. These factors can broadly be divided into two categories. People's state of being, that is their mental state, age, or their relationship to another person, or actions to which they are or have been submitted, such as deception or coercion. Part the first, threat and coercion. Threat and coercion are sometimes perceived as two different things, but they're actually not. When people hear the word threat, they often tend to imagine a direct physical threat, such as being held at gun or knife point, or perhaps also the verbal threat of physical harm. In many people's perception, coercion includes threat, but then also includes other things like emotional manipulation. It's important to remember, though, that something like emotional manipulation is in fact also a kind of threat. I believe it's somewhat safe to say that threat of direct physical harm is the condition people most easily understand as infringing on people's ability to freely say yes. If someone threatens their target with a weapon or makes a verbal threat that they will hurt them if they don't comply, it doesn't matter how much yes they utter. That yes was obtained under duress. The same is true for threats that don't entail physical harm to the target, though. The threat to harm a loved one, for example. The threat to release nudes of your target on the internet, or to shit-talk them to their friends, their family, colleagues, or their boss. Forms of blackmail, essentially, which are designed to deliberately cause negative social and sometimes even legal consequences. The threat of doing harm to yourself, or of holding someone responsible for your own emotional duress if they don't comply with your demands, is also a kind of psychological threat. Things like telling someone that them not having sex with you is the cause of your depression, or that you will consider killing yourself if they don't do you sexual favors. Especially in the event of psychological threat, I have noticed a tendency for people to say something like, well, if sexual assault is so bad, why don't people just choose the other consequences? If they opt for the sexual assault, that's probably not worse then, is it? I'm here to call bullshit. It's irrelevant which harm is worse. People are essentially forced to choose between various types of harm inflicted on them. There is no fair or healthy outcome to these situations. It's not because someone picked performing a sexual act they didn't really want to consent to begin with over having their nudes plastered all over the internet, or the consequence of someone perhaps offing themselves because they wouldn't comply to their sexual demands, that situation is suddenly not harmful to them. This entire argument is sheer victim blaming, and it's also entirely inconsequential. Part the second, deception. When people freely consent to sexual activity, they are doing so under the assumption that they are aware of the reality of all the associated conditions. Say you decide to send nudes to your boyfriend, then you're consenting to that under the assumption that your boyfriend is the only recipient of those pictures. Say his best friend takes his phone, pretends to be him, and gets you to consent to sending nudes. That is a violation of your consent, because you didn't consent to send nudes to his friend at all. Say your boyfriend passes your pictures around among his friends. He's violating your consent, because you did not consent under the condition that this material wouldn't remain private. The line isn't always that clear, though. Say you deliberately lie to someone, telling them that you are madly in love with them and want to have a steady relationship just because you want to get in their pants only to ditch them afterwards. What about if you lie to someone about being vegan because you know that they are vegan and they love animals, and you want to increase your chances of them thinking that you have stuff in common so they will like you more? Does that change depending on whether or not that person has told you that veganism is a morally very significant thing for them and that they could never ever get with someone who eats meat? I think there are two important elements to take into account here. How significant is the thing someone lies about to the person they're trying to get consent from? And is the intentional purpose of the deception to get a yes from somebody who under different conditions might not have consented? Everybody lies. We all want to make a good impression on other people, and that often means hiding our flaws, pretending that we're a little bit better than we really are, overstating similarities between us and other people so we increase our chances of being liked by them. There's really not necessarily so much wrong with that. If I'm out with a really awesome girl and she says, "Oh my god, Nine Inch Nails is my favorite band," I might say, "Holy crap, me too, Nine Inch Nails is amazing." While, you know, that might be a pretty big exaggeration about my feelings towards Nine Inch Nails. I'd probably argue there is no real need to do something like this and that authenticity is important. But let's be honest, there's no real harm in me exaggerating my interest in a band just for an increased opportunity to get close to someone and find out about our compatibility on the more significant stuff. If I do end up sleeping with her, me not liking a band as much as I said I did is probably not gonna be the big deal breaker that makes her feel like I deceived her with the particular purpose of using her for sex. There might be things, however, that are so emotionally or morally significant to people that they do become determining factors in whether or not they want to have relationships and sexual interactions with people. A hardcore environmentalist or anti-speciesist who thinks that eating meat is morally reprehensible might care a whole damn lot if they get into bed with a meat eater. A feminist might care a whole damn lot if they get into bed with a downright misogynist. If you're aware that something is essential to someone's willingness to sleep with you and you deceive them into thinking that these conditions are fulfilled while they are not, you are violating their consent by lying to them about the circumstances that are necessary for them to consent in the first place. Likewise, if you pretend to want a steady relationship because you think someone won't consent if that option isn't on the table, you're upfront constructing false conditions to obtain consent from someone that wouldn't give it otherwise. You didn't even bother to care to find out which conditions were necessary for your potential partner to consent to having sex with you. You basically assumed that they wouldn't consent in the reality of the situation, and therefore you lied. If you want a good example of this sort of thing, think Barney Stinson in How I Met Your Mother, whose entire tactic for hooking up with women revolves around constructing a false narrative and false conditions in order to manufacture their consent. And there is a lot of victim blaming going around here too. I have lost count of the amount of times another character uttered something along the lines of, "Well, if these girls are dumb enough to fall for XYZ type of lie, they got what was coming to them." You know, that, rather than, oh, I don't know, the unequivocal condemnation of the practice of deliberately deceiving people into consenting. Part the third, age. I'm gonna be upfront here, age can be a little tricky. Also remember that we're still not talking from a legal framework. I hope we can all agree that there is something deeply wrong with a 20-year-old having sex with a 10-year-old. But what about a 20-year-old and a 17-year-old? Or a 17-year-old and a 35-year-old? Or two 15-year-olds. There's no hard line we can draw for when age suddenly becomes a factor that infringes on someone's ability to freely consent. There are several elements to consider here, and the more of those that are off, the more fishy a situation is. One of these elements is emotional maturity and baggage. Is somebody emotionally mature enough to consider and anticipate the dynamics of an adult sexual relationship? Do they have the necessary experience and independence of mind to identify manipulative strategies and identify their own boundaries accurately? These can be difficult things even for adults, but there is an increased risk for teenagers who are still in the middle of their emotional and cognitive development and who are therefore significantly more impressionable and less autonomous in their decision making. And you also can't really plaster one specific age on one specific stage of development. One 16-year-old, for example, might be a lot further along that process than another one. Another element to consider is the influence of potential previous trauma people have experienced. A teenager who grew up in an abusive home or was bullied a lot, for example, can experience significant influence on their development. They might develop unhealthy coping strategies, problems with emotional attachment or self-image, and again, these things might also be problems for adults, but teenagers are still in the middle of their development. They have had less means and time to adequately process their traumatic experiences, to gain the necessary insight to them, or to develop healthy coping strategies. Another important factor is the age gap and minor versus adult status. Someone who is significantly older is likely more conscious of emotional dynamics and how to play into them. They are in a position that makes it a lot easier for them to groom, manipulate, or coerce younger individuals who are less experienced and less far along in their development. An adult, then, by default, has more independence, social status, and access to financial, social, and legal power and resources than a minor. This creates an inherent power imbalance, which makes it a lot easier for an adult to make a minor dependent on their help or approval, or to threaten consequences. It needs to be said, though, that it is not abnormal sexual development for teenagers to experiment with sex. It's not inherently problematic for them to engage in sexual activity, but, and this is important, there is no need for them to do that with adults. Minor adult relationships are fundamentally unequal, and they are at great risk of being harmful or downright abusive. 16-year-olds giving each other head is pretty normal, folks, and it gets a lot less risky if you do a good job educating them about safe sex and consent. So I suggest you do that instead of puritanically keeping them away from accurate information. There is a reason teen pregnancy rates and STI prevalence is lower in many European countries than in, say, the US. A good number of European countries have more comprehensive, more accurate, and less fear-mongering and repressive sexual education. Want to protect your kids? The best thing you can do is give them access to accurate information and cultivate a culture of trust around this topic, so that if they do want to explore, they can do so in a healthy and safe manner. This is not to say that minors can't cause each other harm, but in a situation between two minors of roughly the same age, that age is not the element that causes an act to be harmful. Now, I've had sexual relationships with adults as a minor, and while most of them were definitely to some extent harmful, not all of them were. It is the significant risk that matters though. Be extremely careful, and as a rule of thumb, I'd say don't have sex with minors if you're an adult, and if you're a minor, experiment safely and consensually with people your own age. Part the fourth, institutional power. Freely given consent occurs between people with equal power in their relationship. A power imbalance distorts the situation in favor of the person with the most power, while leaving the person with less power with less freedom to make autonomous decisions. Power imbalances come in many forms, and I hope you can all see how such an imbalance is also present in situations which contain explicit threats. Another example that I haven't explicitly mentioned yet is a situation in which someone leverages financial power over their partner to coerce consent. But there is also such a thing as institutional power imbalance. In these scenarios, it's not really necessary for someone to be actively and deliberately abusive or threaten the abuse of their power over someone in order for consent to be compromised. Think dynamics such as teachers and students, employers and employees, prison staff and inmates, or even landlords and tenants. In all of these scenarios, one person has power over another person's future and well-being because they have official institutional control over aspects that significantly influence their future and well-being. Things like grades or employment or housing. And I know what some of you are thinking. But Ames, if someone doesn't have bad intentions and doesn't actually abuse their power, what's the problem? Well, two things. First of all, it doesn't require an explicit threat or act of power abuse for someone in a vulnerable position to be aware of the power dynamic and the potential risks it entails. If my boss comes on to me, they might genuinely like me and have the best of intentions, but to me, that is the person who does my performance review, the person with the power to make my employment miserable or to even decide if I have a job tomorrow. I don't know what I'm putting at risk by rejecting their advances, and I might end up complying with things I'm not comfortable with in order not to jeopardize my job. There is a lot of deliberate abuse going on between people with institutional power and those over whom they wield it. But even with the best of intentions, my employer might not be aware that I'm just complying because I worry about the consequences if I don't, let alone if I speak out about how I find his actions inappropriate. But as the person in power, it is their job to consider that possibility and avoid doing that kind of harm. Secondly, if anyone here is 100% comfortable predicting their response to the souring of an initially pleasant relationship, let me know. And for any of you now ready to give me those guarantees, sorry, no. You're deluding yourselves. A relationship might be fine now, there might not be a problem while it's going on, but what happens when you part, especially if it's not on friendly terms? People aren't always good at predicting their own behavior. This works fine, you say, until it doesn't. These are the reasons why, for example, colleges or companies prohibit sexual relationships between staff and students or managers and employees, or at the very least, require these relationships to be disclosed to HR. This is why, if such relationships are allowed at all, there might be measures in place to ensure that you don't hold exclusive power over the grades or the performance reviews of the people that you're sleeping with. Are all relationships between people with institutional power and those without it deliberately abusive? No. Do the ones that are fine in the moment necessarily end in abusive behavior after the fact? No. But once more with feeling, the point here is the significant risk inherent in the dynamic. Part the 5th. Alcohol and other substances. Freely giving consent technically requires that someone is in the possession of their full mental faculty, and alcohol or drug use can infringe on that. We're hopefully all aware by now that when someone doesn't say yes to sexual activity, it is entirely irrelevant whether they are sober or under the influence. There is, per default, no consent in this situation, but I feel like there is so much misconception about this that it needs a bit of touching on before we jump into what happens when someone who is under the influence responds really enthusiastically to the prospect of jumping your bones. Telling a person who was sexually assaulted under the influence of drugs or alcohol that they should have just stayed sober is another instance of victim blaming. When someone doesn't consent, it doesn't matter for shit how sober they were. Somebody else decided not to give a flying fuck that they didn't have consent to do what they did. That is all that matters. To be clear, a drunk or drugged person technically can't consent, but I am not the kind of person who thinks that there is no nuance at all to your responsibility. Do not engage in sex with a drunk person who, in effect, responds very enthusiastically to the prospect of jumping your bones. That is not the sort of nuance people are employing when they sneer at people who've experienced harm that they should have just been more responsible with their substance use, though. Also, keep in mind that drugs and alcohol are often deliberately used by people with an intent to abuse in order to more easily manipulate their target or weaken their ability to resist. Yes, a person who is themselves under the influence is still responsible when their actions cross someone else's boundaries. Nobody is letting you off the hook when you drunk drive and hit a biker, not even when that biker was also drunk. And just like people aren't inherently prone to drunk drive, we're also not inherently prone to ignore consent when we're drunk. There are underlying patterns which make it more or less likely for people to engage in harmful behavior when they're not sober. It is a lot less likely for someone to engage in drunk driving when they are properly educated on the subject and have internalized the ideas and attitudes around that. Just like it is a lot less likely for people to engage in harmful sexual behavior when they have been properly educated on consent and have internalized ideas and attitudes around that. Note that if you are a bystander who sees someone get frisky with someone who hasn't consented or is in no state to be able to do so, you can help. Just like you can try to prevent a drunk person from driving and maybe take their car keys, you can try and prevent someone from engaging in non-consensual sexual activity. That also means that you could potentially interfere when your totally wasted friend responds very enthusiastically to the prospect of jumping someone else's bones, by the way. And now for the complicated part. Say someone is pretty out of this world, but they do respond very enthusiastically to the prospect of jumping someone else's bones. Technically, an inebriated person can't consent, but is it always that simple, practically speaking? No. I think that in this scenario it is to an extent relevant whether or not people already know each other and whether or not the other person is sober. It also definitely matters if the person who engaged in sexual activity while inebriated actually feels harmed afterwards. Some situations may seem fishy to outsiders, and they might be in theory because they are pretty risky when it comes to subjecting people to harm, but you can't just go around and dictate that people should feel damaged after the fact when they don't. You can be aware of and educate people on the dynamics and risks of certain situations while still acknowledging that not 100% of their individual occurrences must definitely always result in harm. Anyway, say that Here is a person who is pretty wasted, but responds very enthusiastically to the prospect of jumping your bones. And you are sober. Does it matter? And I'd say, yeah, to an extent. The fact that you're sober means that you don't really have an excuse to casually forget that a drunk person can't technically consent. Not that I so much think that you really have an excuse for that when you are yourself drunk, but I'd be a bit dishonest if I can't see a situation where two drunk people are mutually very enthusiastic about jumping each other's bones, and that there is just no malice involved in them just not second guessing that consent. When you are sober though and you realize this other person is drunk, I don't really have sympathy for that. Side note, because I know that there are people watching this who are going to forget, but a drunk person seeing another drunk person respond with, "Yes, let's fuck, that's a great idea," is an entirely different situation than a drunk person seeing another drunk person not say yes to sexual activity, or maybe not even respond at all, and thinking, who needs them to say yes anyway? Those two things, not in the same boat. It has to be said, though, that it might not always be clear, even to a sober person, that someone is actually drunk. Not everybody responds the same way to alcohol or drugs, for that matter. One cocktail can mean being completely off their rocker for one person, while it hardly affects somebody else. And even if someone is severely affected by drugs or alcohol, that might not always be as apparent in their outward behavior. Especially when you're not familiar with another person, it can be difficult for even a sober person to discern exactly how drunk someone is. And again, a sober person not being able to discern that somebody is actually in effect drunk is not the same situation as a sober person noticing that someone's drunk off their rocker and thinking that, you know, they can take advantage of this consent without having to think about it in its context for 2 seconds. I also find it kind of hard to say how drunk is drunk when we consider that it infringes on people's ability to freely consent. And rule of thumb, I'd probably say that if someone seems too drunk to drive a car, you should also probably not let them drive you. There's also a thing to be said for how well you know a person, your awareness of their ability to indicate their boundaries in various states of mind, knowing them well enough to determine if they're still in a position to indicate discomfort when that's necessary. Not to say that people being familiar with each other completely cancels out the risk of them doing each other harm, but there are degrees of risk here. Here's the thing that makes this part difficult. For a lot of people, sex is fun. And for a lot of people, getting buzzed is fun. And it might not be a stretch to consider that having buzzed sex, for a lot of people, is something that they're actually into. And frankly, I think that's okay. And yeah, it does take a lot of consideration of various aspects that might increase the risk of someone feeling harmed afterwards. And I really think that this part, this topic, the combination of sex and alcohol and what if someone drunkenly says yes to something, that is really one of the hardest things in all of this to navigate. I'd say it's definitely the least straightforward. There is a lot of wild screaming from people about how suddenly everyone's calling regrettable drunken one-night stands rape, and no, actually, they're not. This really boils back down to how much of a selfish flip-flop you were in response to someone sharing that you've made them feel uncomfortable or hurt. And I touched on this in the last part, but I think it is really important to reiterate here. You might not have meant it. Things may have seemed fine. You may have genuinely believed that they were. But here is the thing. Misunderstandings happen. Miscommunication happens. Even when you thought that you'd considered every angle and that you were as careful as you should have been, people might still end up feeling harmed. It's not hard to acknowledge that. It is not difficult to listen and empathize. You know what makes people refer to regrettable drunken one-night stands as rape? Dismissal. The feeling that you genuinely don't give a fuck. That you couldn't care less about somebody else's experience of events. That is what makes you come off like an abusive asshole. That is what makes people feel like you were just in it for yourself and there to deliberately take advantage of them to begin with. And I reiterate, because this is important, if you give a crap about the humanity of the people you sleep with, don't be a dismissive twat about how they experience events and then have the audacity to blame them for thinking you are a massive asshole who just wanted to use them as a prop for their own satisfaction. I have been in the position where I have caused people harm this way. I have also been in the position where people accused me of causing that harm and where I had to respond to that. I think there are some good lessons to be learned from that, so, count on that being material for a future video sometime. I realize that I probably didn't cover absolutely everything. Grooming, for example, is something that I mentioned when we were talking about age, but I didn't really go into any further because it is a pretty big topic all on its own, and I, at the time, don't really feel equipped to adequately tackle that. If you have any questions or comments about this video, though, or additions about things that I didn't mention, leave them in a comment section below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! A big thanks to my patrons who support the making of these videos. If you thought this video was interesting or makes for a good contribution to society, consider joining them and dropping me a monthly $1 or $2 to help me pay for rent while I make more of these, or send me a one-time donation on Ko-fi. You can find the links in the nether regions. Thanks!